This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Probably in a really great position right now looking down at me. It's actually a little bit weirder from this end. But yeah, I'm a third-year urban planning student, and MUPS is having their annual general meeting tomorrow, and there will be elections for the MUPS committee as well as a chance to get to know some fellow students in your semester and other semesters. If you haven't heard of MUPS, it's the Melbourne Uni Planning Student Society, so anyone in here that's planning students, which is probably most of you. If you haven't gotten involved before, it's a really good organization. I would strongly recommend going to the meeting tomorrow, becoming a member. There are social events as well as professional events like help with going to interviews and crafting your resume, and industry night where you get to meet people from different planning jobs, and it's really worthwhile. It's $5 tomorrow to join and be a member, and that's for the entire year. So that gets you into all of the MUPS events, social events and industry events as well. Can I write down the details?
Yeah, if you are prepared to use chalk.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
So yeah, hopefully everyone can read that. It's a bit hard to write on chalkboard. But yes, tomorrow 6 to 9 p.m. in the MSD staff room, which is on level 4. It's the nice fancy room that we probably won't have another chance to use for the rest of the year. So yeah, anyways, I'm running for president of MUPS, and so would love to see you guys there voting in the elections. But even if you don't vote or you want to run yourself, come along. It's really worthwhile to join the organization. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so last week, I hope nothing odd is happening with this, but last week we got up to, hang on, it's fighting me slightly. We got up to describing the assignment, and I think some of the tutors have started to talk to you about that. If they haven't, today will be the day. And just a reminder, complete worksheet 1 first. You might even want to make a foray into worksheet number 2 before you start the assignment, because that takes you through some of the fundamentals. So a lot of the work in this subject is such that it's a little bit slavish, if that's the right word, for me to take you through every single step, but rather I try to provide you with a framework, and then the worksheets and the assignments let you go through at your own speed with other readings and information, plus, I guess, top-ups of information and guidance from the tutors. So ask your tutors more about that as you move through the next couple of weeks. So, I think the chalk's getting to me. Today, I want to go through fairly quickly scheme amendments. You'll get a few goes at scheme amendments, but if we were to break the planning system down, and in fact just about all planning systems have this general breakdown between two main things that are going on. One is making plans and the other is implementing plans. Of course, this can play out in many different ways of understanding what a plan or planning is. But in this planning system, like others in Australia and many in the States and Canada, we have these processes of amendment, which is the forward-looking component, and the second part is administration, mainly oriented to processing applications. There may be a lot or just a little bit of discretion in number 2, the administration component. So we're going to look at scheme amendments. Some parts of this I'll go through slowly, and other parts I will go through fairly rapidly, understanding that you will look at those again later in a reinforcing way, and we'll come at it from a few directions with some of the planning law stuff which comes up in a few weeks. So if you don't get it straight away, don't worry. Rather, I need to show you the whole process a few times for it to really stick. So what is the planning scheme amendment? Essentially, we are changing the planning scheme. Occasionally, it is to introduce a brand new planning scheme. Obviously, that's not happening too much. So on the whole, it's changing parts of the planning scheme. It might be a rezoning, say from an industrial zone to residential, or whatever it might be, extra overlays, or changing other elements of the planning scheme, or it might be, in the case of the Minister's powers, changing the whole of the Victoria planning provisions, or more typically, just part of the VPPs. And of course, sometimes there might be some little errors or mistakes, or things don't fit together properly, and often we bundle them together into what we call an omnibus amendment, where all the little mistakes of spelling or grammar or things that didn't quite work get fixed up in one hit. So, who can prepare an amendment? The Minister has powers to give responsibility to certain people. Usually it is the Council acting as the planning authority, that very specific role that you'll see set out in the Act. Sometimes the Minister will take on that role, him or herself. Maybe another Minister, say for example, Minister for Local Government might be given the role sometimes, and sometimes statutory authorities like water bodies, etc. So a lot of that detail is in sections 8, 9 and 11, and indeed section 12 and 13, because they set out the powers of planning authorities and responsible authorities. So I'd encourage you, as you go through this, when you study, to have a copy of the Act on your screen or even a hard copy, and just keep getting this habit of thinking about these core processes in respect of the sections of the Act. You don't need to know the whole Act, but to be able to go to the relevant component of the Act and be able to say, the planning authority is this, and it's under section, and get that thinking straight. A lot of the work and a lot of the credibility you gain in these roles will come from the ability to do that efficiently. So there are two main processes. 99% of the time it's a standard C amendment, as in for one individual council. And you'll see the nomenclature has a C in front of it, and perhaps if you've started working through the worksheets, you will have seen that that is in there, and it's sequentially for a given council, has C1, C2 and so forth. So I'll take you through these steps tonight. As I say, don't be overwhelmed. Once you go through it a few times, and perhaps you'll look at different sources, not just me, but say the guides provided by DELP, and look in Stephen Rowley's book, get it from a few different angles. It'll settle in, because while it's not always a logical logic, it has its own internal logic. That sounds a bit Rumsfeldian, doesn't it? But there's a reason for these steps, and once you get the feel for those, it's not as hard to learn as you might think. So before we go into that in a bit of detail, the other type of amendment, which we would sometimes call an extraordinary type of amendment, is an amendment by the Minister. Usually it is using powers in the Act from 20 Part 4, which allows the Minister to make changes without exhibiting and without getting independent advice, on the basis of it being of state significance. So while it seems like the Minister does this all the time, it's only a very small percentage of the time, but usually it's about important things. So the most typical one will be changing the entire Victoria planning provisions, and that might have impacts across every single authority. For instance, by changing a definition or by changing the state planning policy framework. And that provides a very powerful mechanism for keeping consistency across the whole of Victoria and for efficiently and effectively changing planning schemes. It may also be excessive in some people's opinion in that the minister has a lot of power. On the other hand, the minister's part of an elected government and it is his or her role to use the planning system to achieve the objectives of the government of the day. So, you know, it's not just about technical planning here. We sometimes see the influence of politics on this in various ways, and within the law, I might say, in those processes. So probably the biggest example of this in recent history has been the introduction of the urban growth boundary. I think that was 2002. My memory's starting to fail me. Where we didn't have any sort of urban growth boundary in Victoria around the metropolitan area, or indeed any of the built-up areas. And to avoid rampant land speculation and perhaps corruption and things like that, it was kept very secret that there was going to be an urban growth boundary around the edge of the city. So it was all done in secret and in camera, and then bang, the UGB was brought in one swift move using 20 Part 4 powers because it was considered fairer, if such a thing can be fair, to do it without a lot of consultation. So just 3 steps: initiation and preparation. Maybe you involve the public. The minister can appoint a panel if they choose to, and they can exhibit if they choose to, and the minister decides. You should remember that it would be very rare for a minister to make a decision without a lot of inputs from his or her advisors. So it's not just the minister coming up with stuff out of the blue. They get a lot of advice to make these decisions. Whether or not they're good decisions is sometimes debatable. If you wanted to think of a great case study of that, perhaps the rezoning of Fisherman's Bend might be one to think about that had quite profound implications we're still trying to deal with. So, let's go through these steps. Apologies if I sort of have to plod through them, but as we go through and you learn that, then you kind of rise above the bureaucratic steps to actually thinking about the real issues of the day that are worked out by effectively changing the law, changing the rules that apply to land through a scheme amendment in sometimes small, sometimes quite profound ways. So we'll go through the normal case, which is using most of the steps, and I'll explain what that means in a few minutes. The first one is that often there is some desire to change the planning scheme. It could be for all kinds of reasons. Someone might want to initiate a project to maybe develop some parkland or to sell off public land and they want to raise its value before selling it, for example. Things are out of date. All of a sudden there's a new heritage report and they go, "Whoa, wow, we need heritage overlays on that land there." You name it. And in that process, before it becomes a statutory process, usually there's a lot of negotiation. It could even be a developer asking local government to change the rules or the zone or the overlay on a piece of land. That's all legitimate, and there's lots of negotiation going on at that time. Developers love the idea of rezoning land, obviously in their own favour, as in to make money or to develop. That's entirely legitimate, but they often don't get their way because council, as in the planning authority, City of Yarra, City of Melbourne, etc., need to be convinced to take it on. And we try in this system not to do a lot of rezoning. We try to use the flexibility within existing rules rather than rezoning again and again. You go to other states in Australia and overseas, rezonings are much more common in those places. So, generally speaking, we apply these rather common sense tests, one of which there is likely to be successful. There are many, many steps through the amendment process at which an amendment can stop proceeding and it can fail. But the primary test that is always applied throughout, and particularly at the very end where the minister makes a decision, is, does this fit with the policy and circumstances of the day in the spirit of the Act and the Victoria planning provisions? So if it's just for selfish reasons, say you're a council around the Brighton area and you don't like new developments in your council area, and you just block everything that might be about increasing density, maybe you won't be successful with the minister because you're not doing it in the spirit of the planning scheme and of the Act. So these tests are all applied. So basically we don't start them unless we think they're kind of reasonable. And the other point that often comes up that people don't necessarily think of, can we do it anyway just through the existing set of rules that we have at our disposal? A scheme amendment is likely to take at least 1 year and possibly 2 years, but sometimes you could just do it without a permit, or maybe you could even change what is proposed without a permit, or just a fairly quick permit as well. So taking on a scheme amendment process is a huge undertaking, and many of the costs for that are borne by the local authority. So you've got to try pretty hard to convince them. But, is it consistent with the scheme is the other big test. But the next test you get to is a relatively new step. It hasn't always been in the planning scheme. I think it's 7 years old now, that you need to get initial approval by the minister before you can even proceed. The reason this test is here is that there was a sense that many local authorities were starting scheme amendments, which, as I said, take 1 or 2 years. The local authority would begin the process for political reasons without ever expecting there was much chance at all of being successful. So political gamesmanship, and I can understand perhaps why they would do that, because the process of maybe 2 years of scheme amendment, they might have 1 year before an election's coming up, so they're making decisions on those bases, or they're just misguided. So the overview of the minister is in many places through the planning scheme and the Planning Act, and this step in the process of amendment is a very powerful one. So does it fit in with state policy and the objectives of planning? If it gets the go-ahead, there is a decision by council to proceed with an amendment. So that decision is a democratic decision, insofar as it is by the elected officials of the planning authority. City of Melbourne, City of Yarra, City of Moreland, etc. So there's another hurdle to jump, that it's got to fit in with what the majority of councillors, as in the elected people, actually want to do in the authority. So you can see changing the rules is not necessarily that easy, and it depends on the political flavour of a place often. So they have to formally vote, and they are given a whole lot of background to it, and that's just to decide to commence with the process, because it demands quite a few resources to do. There's no appeal rights in this process, which is relatively unusual in the planning system of Victoria, because there's appeal rights about a lot of things, or objection rights, but not in this case. I suppose the only appeal right or right you might have is if there's some corruption or something like that. Not so common in Victoria, not unheard of, but not very common. So generally speaking, you could say there's no real appeal right for this. So if we manage to jump those hurdles to run with an amendment, then all the documentation is prepared. This could be a small amount of material if it was just a rezoning to one little bit of land, or it could be a huge project and there'd be all expert reports like geotechnical reports and design reports and heritage reports and water catchment assessments and all kinds of things. All that is brought together, as well as the actual changes to the rules that are being proposed. I'll provide you with a quick little example of this stuff after I go through this, by the way, so you'll get another look at it. And this is where the real forward planning work is undertaken to understand whether or not this should go ahead and what are the reasons, and actually can we fine-tune it to make it just right. And there could be some consultation. So council might do this themselves, but more commonly, if a developer or a proponent has asked for this to be done, usually the proponent, imagine the developer, will take on those costs. This is slightly tricky in that, so well, they're changing the rules and they're paying for it, so they're paying people to do it in their favour. And I guess, yeah, that's true. But there are a number of checks through the process, particularly the independent panel process, where it kind of shouldn't matter who prepared it. It should stand on its merits. But it is something to have a bit of a think what this might mean. And then very specific documentation, and you'll see in worksheet 2, I ask you to go and look at this documentation, needs to be prepared in a particular form. And that's so it will comply with the planning scheme and it will provide the basis for some careful decision making as well. So then, if all that is prepared in accordance with the Act and the VPPs and the practice notes for scheme amendments, we get to the stage of exhibition. So this is the stage where it's advertised. People who live in the area and particularly directly adjacent are sent letters. There'll be signs on the site. There will be the ability to look things up on the website for the Planning Authority, that people will be able to go and look at it, or maybe they'll just do it online, and they will be able to make submissions about whether or not they support or oppose or seek changes to the amendment itself. So you can see in the Victorian system there are many, many chances for other parties to be involved. The primary test being, is this in accordance with the planning scheme and state planning policy and the Act and any local particularities about that site. So you can see here, section 19 requests or requires it must be at least 30 days, and in the case of larger projects, 60 days effectively to put that out there. There are also, if there are public agencies involved, say a road agency or a water catchment agency, etc., then they are formally sent this for them to respond to. So the idea here is that it's not just people, seeking their own interests, although that's fine, that can be part of it, but rather we throw things open, and on the basis that if we get lots and lots of inputs, decision makers, and in this case it's the panel and council and the minister, if more information comes in from all of the different viewpoints, the decision maker or the recommender has the widest range of information at their disposal, and then they'll make the best decision. So that's the general idea behind it, allied with natural justice, as in we give everyone a chance to have a say in whatever way that they are able to do so. So people get notice, people can lodge submissions. A component of the Act at section 20 says they're allowed to, and then all of those submissions are available for viewing. So this is in the interest of transparency as well as natural justice, and avoid things like corruption or even the sense that good process hasn't been followed. It doesn't really say anywhere, but things need to be in writing to have any force, to have any standing. Local authorities provide translation and writing help if people request it. But excuse me, but I would say articulate people who understand the planning system generally do have quite an advantage in these processes, because they can process all the information and write stuff about it. So at this stage we sort of get a deviation between processes. If no one has made a submission about a scheme amendment, then the council, the planning authority, can adopt it and send it straight through to the minister. And that does happen from time to time with minor matters that no one's too bothered about. It could be just fixing a problem or an inconsistency, or maybe just everyone supports it. But normally, that's quite unusual because there's a lot of different interested parties in these processes. So if there is just one submission that is against an amendment, then it has to either change it, the amendment that's proposed, abandon it. That does happen. They might just say, wow, there's so much public opposition to this amendment, we're just going to let it go. Or three, the most common one, is that the planning authority will request the minister to appoint and convene a panel to hear all of the submissions. So that's required by the Act under section 23. Planning panels play a very important role. They're appointed, the panellists are appointed by the minister, can have 1, 2 or 3 members, and they have a primary purpose, which is deciding whether the amendment should proceed. They have a fair bit of responsibility to take on because they're appointed not on behalf of the planning authority or the minister or anyone, but on behalf of Planning Panels Victoria, and they look to existing policy in the VPPs and in the Act and any other relevant information, and they must actively seek out, to a reasonable amount, information that is relevant to them making a recommendation. It's an independent recommendation. So this is an expert panel, and typically they will have expertise of various kinds, and when they're appointed to a panel, they say, oh, we need one stat planner, we need someone who knows a bit about geotechnics, someone who knows a bit about about surveying, for example, according to what is being proposed. And then they set dates and they run their processes as they see fit as an independent panel. And there are rules about this. They must be held publicly. They follow natural justice, as I was saying before. They must allow people to have a fair go. Whoever you are, whatever you want to say, you might think, wow, they're kind of crazy, but you still need to let them have a go within reason. And people can be represented by lawyers or friends or relatives, etc. And the idea is that we get all the arguments on the table. The hearings are relatively informal. Obviously, people have to be nice and polite and take turns in those things. But, you know, they're kind of relaxed. In the spirit of, I guess you could say, trying to arrive at a professional position on this with all the information at our disposal. So after that process is that Council must show how it responds in a formal report to all of the submissions that have come in. And some they might say, that's not really a planning concern, we don't care if the people, you know, who are doing that are motivated by business interests, but we do care if it's to do with the settlement policy as set out in Victoria planning provisions. So, you know, they must show how they take it all on and how they respond. And when all that's come in to the panel, they gather it up, and they might take 1 to 3 months, depending on the complexity. And the panel, remembering that they're an independent body, package that up in a report. They show that they've heard everybody and they've considered what they say. They set all the facts out and then they make a recommendation. And I've posed a question there, you know, what's the main basis for their reasoning in making a recommendation? What do they look to? I've probably said it a few times tonight, but just to reinforce. What's the main thing that the panel will look to when making a recommendation? Planning scheme. Is it valid? Yep. Does it, you know, start at the very top, section 4, the objectives, and think of the purposes of the Act, working their way right down to the planning scheme, state policy, local policy. Does it make sense within this policy matrix, we sometimes call it, and is it in the interest of all Victorians? And however much complexity is required to do that. The panel tends to depend on experts providing expertise about things. So say it's a heritage matter, they will depend on any experts if they've got credibility and standing, and they'll tend to follow those expert positions. When you get differing expert opinion, they have to balance that off and make their own decision in their recommendation. So what do they recommend? No change, to change the amendment, or to abandon it, depending on whether or not they think that it fits in with planning in Victoria and all the documents that talk about those policies and those legalities. Then Council must make the panel report public 28 days after receiving it. They get 28 days to process it and think about their own position that they're going to take on it. Then they make it public, and they have to demonstrate they've formally considered it. And normally what will happen, the planning officers will sort of package it up for the councillors, and then they must make a decision. So the panel only make a recommendation as experts, but when it goes to the council is formed of elected politicians, effectively, elected officials. They're councillors. And they take all the facts before them, and then they'll make the formal decision about what to do. So, as I said before, they could decide to abandon it. Often if something is really politically unfavourable, they will, or they'll just push through without any changes, or they'll change it according to what the panel says. However, if it's a complete transformation, if they want to proceed, they have to go right back to the start again, because what was originally exhibited is what people made submissions on. So that's a bit of a legal question we'll talk about in the latter part of the semester, what constitutes a transformation. But generally speaking, if we're proposing to make changes to allow a shopping centre, and then on the way through people said, actually I reckon it might be better as a commercial park, you know, obviously that's not allowed, because the people who looked at it first said, yeah, shopping centre's great. They might not have actually accepted or supported or opposed in the same way a very different proposal. So you can see this kind of logic to still get decisions made, but to also let everyone have a say, to try and make decisions eventually, underlies a lot of the stuff that goes on through the processes throughout the planning system, but particularly in the amendment and the permitting process. So, importantly, the council, the councillors, may go against the panel. They might even go against their own town planners that they employ, remembering that they are a group of elected politicians. And they might be strongly pro-development, or they might be really interested in heritage matters, or they might just oppose everything because they don't want any change. You know, so all those things are possible, and you know, you get all of the different variations on those things, because here's where sort of democracy meets technical and procedural matters in the local council chamber. So depending what they decide to do, if they've decided to proceed, here's where everything, and I mean everything, all the submissions and all the technical reports, everything is put together in a package and it's sent to the Minister. And that's according to section 31 of the Act. And the Minister expects that everything would be before him or her suitable to make a decision at that time. And the Minister formally considers it, and it comes down to three directions that he or she might go: to refuse it, to approve it, or approve it with changes. It is possible that the Minister might take political considerations into account, but they won't admit that. They are doing it on the basis of policy. But I think it's fair to say some of the very large and contentious proposals, for example, the St Kilda Hotel might be an example where it became international. You know, people were writing letters from overseas about this big change. The Minister took quite a careful position on refusing those changes that were proposed, after initially being incredibly supportive of the project. On the whole, however, the Minister tends to go with the recommendations of the panel. Why do you think that might generally be the case? He's thinking what the panel's role and how they think is. Seems unbiased. That's pretty much right on. The panel is a group of experts who take quite a bit of time to gather up all the rational, technical information in accordance with the planning scheme, so they tend to be more consistent. They tend to have thought all that through, so it's unusual for the Minister not to go along with the panel. You know, he or she may differ in some ways, and they might decide to change it in certain ways, but usually the panel's one of the best indications of how things might go. So the Minister's got the power to make that decision, and then it takes force as a legal change to the planning system only when it is gazetted in the Government Gazette. That's normally on a Thursday afternoon, although I haven't seen a hard copy of the Gazette for some years now because it happens online. But there still is an actual Gazette. And as soon as that decision is gazetted, it has force, as in they're the rules of the day that you must stand by. The only appeals that are allowed to be made are defects of procedure. They do happen, but because of the huge expense and time taken, planning officers and other associated people are very, very careful to comply with all the bits of the Act. So, you know, after 2 years, you don't, oh God, we didn't exhibit it properly at the very start, you know. And in fact, usually someone would have picked it up earlier and they would have gone back and done it anyway. So that's the process in the sort of the long and drawn out way of describing it. These amendments, as I said, can be about anything. So now I'm going to go through at pretty fast speed an example, just to give you a real life kind of case. Then we'll go on to the stuff in lecture 3. So as I say, don't worry if that seems pretty fast. You'll be able to go back through it many, many times and understand it. So this is an example of C18 and C19 in the city of Darebin. It's a few years ago, but I've kept using it because it's quite a good example of some of the complexities. If you don't know where that is, it's pretty much straight north from where we are right now in Melbourne, and had a lot of history. One of the big problems was that in the 1920s, and in fact we've had many cases of this, where re-subdivision of land has occurred in ways that weren't particularly careful, and lots of stuff went on. It was set aside as a freeway reservation. We've subsequently discovered that there are threatened grassland species there, and essentially it sat there unused and everyone was very uncertain about it because it had too many complicated things going on at once. So this was the land here, and you'll see it's got on the street directory map. We don't see these very often nowadays, do we? Because it's all on GPS or Google Maps. But it actually showed that roads were here. And that's one of the characteristics of the complexities of this problem, was that these roads were gazetted as roads, as in they're on the cadastre, or were on the cadastre. But the land was unserviced and undeveloped. It had all these other impediments to development on the land. So it put everyone involved in this rather difficult bind, and the land was owned by various parties and agencies as well, including members of the public. So we were really stuck on this site. So this is what it looked like on the planning scheme, the original one, and it looks like a little residential subdivision. But in fact, that's the reality of it, that most of it was grassland and a place for bogans to go around in their cars and burn them when they were stolen and things like that. So it had a bad reputation, etc. And there was a big drain going through the middle of it, back in the bad old days where we just scour out the land and send water down drains. And then it was identified as part of significant grasslands as the consciousness of environmental importance of different species began to be identified. Particularly, grasslands don't look particularly glamorous. It's not like a rainforest, but they actually have a lot of environmental significance in some places, and a lot of species exist in those as well. and what to do. And this had been a problem for 60 years or more. So the big turning point here was when the local authority council and VicRoads formed a joint venture to buy the land, and the big idea was to sell some off to developers to allow the retention of the best part of the grasslands. So that's the sort of financial bit in the background that was conquered. And the first part was that some technical information was developed, basically working out which bits of grassland were of high quality and which were of lower quality. And it's not the most beautiful map, but it conveys the message that some of it was actually in pretty good shape. And accordingly, the one on the right there was saying, okay, well, how about we keep that good quality grassland and we sell the stuff to the right in the darker red, we'll sell that off so we can keep the grasslands. And to do that, we will need to rezone the land. We'll get rid of that old lot pattern, we'll change the zonings. So there's a lot of steps here. But one of the complicating factors is that people own individual lots in the middle, even though they didn't have drains and sewers and telcos and even a road to get there. So there were some other complications that some people had inherited these lots that have been held in the family since the 1920s. So that's my inheritance. How can you take it away from me? So a fair bit going on. So then a concept was worked up and lots of people consulted, and the numbers were crunched about how much you'd make from the subdivision and how much it would cost to improve the grasslands. And then the statutory planning bit, Amendment C18, was prepared, and that included a public acquisition overlay to buy the privately owned lots. By this time it was only 11 different lots. And to acquire the land as if they were Zone Residential 1, which was a zone at the time, to be fair on them so they could go and buy something else comparable. And then a separate but parallel amendment changed the grasslands bits to a zoning appropriate for grasslands, and the development plan overlay and the DDO were to make sure that the development on the top right hand side was appropriate and well designed. So, and there was also there's a provision in the Act to allow a parallel permit application, so move it fast. So I'll go through this fairly quickly to give the flavour of it. This is all on the lecture slides anyway, but it was exhibited. This was the map that was exhibited, as in the land that was acquired under the public acquisition overlay. These were closed because they had officially been gazetted as roads in the past, so that needs to be dealt with formally. This was going to be changed to a public conservation and resource zone. This was already zoned residential. And then got rid of some of the old rules that no longer applied. So you can see they're marked as deleted. So these are all documents from what was exhibited publicly, so that the public and anyone else who was interested could see that nothing devious was going on, or oppose it if it was a bad idea. And then added a design and development overlay here to ensure the quality of the new development. So 16 submissions were received, lots of different ideas about it. Some people opposed it on environmental grounds. On the whole, people were pretty pleased that something was happening. And there was a submission. Various interested parties were allowed to have a say. The council, Vic Urban, Department of Natural Resources and Environment, etc. Some of the big utilities. And as always, with the planning process, it boiled down to a few main issues. And this is something you should think about as a practitioner in planning. Usually, a lot of stuff is either no or yes. Generally, what we spend all our time on is the issues stuff. It's in the grey area, or how do we resolve this stuff? So, does it fit in with the VPPs? Just does it make sense in that policy framework? There was a strategy all about the environmental matters to do with the creek. How did it fit in with council's strategy? And this big test, okay, we're going to lose some grasslands here, but we're going to keep some grasslands here, and losing some will pay off. So that question was there. And then some impacts in the local area, people who live nearby. And the panel brought all that together and they recommended an adoption with some changes and some of the permit conditions. And if you want, you can look that up under Amendments Online, the website, and you can read that panel report if you want to use it, you know, as something to study. So then it went through to the Minister and it was approved. The private lots were acquired and the development plan was agreed to. So previously it looked like that, and that was the design that was followed, and then I'm just tracking through. These were acquired. Now that's what you'd see if you looked at the street directory, and that's what was actually built there, a little subdivision development. The grasslands are fenced off to stop people driving through in cars and etc. Information about the environmental significance is there, and the subdivision went ahead. So generally a bit of a success story on a very, very challenging site. Sometimes I think the design was a bit questionable, but that's roughly what it looks like today. It's slightly out of date now, actually. That's all been built out now. So, you know, grasslands don't necessarily look exciting, but they are an important environmental asset in many locations, and that's been protected. So, that's a little example for you. This link probably won't work. Let's try it out. Oh, don't know what that means. You should be aware, if you're not already, that there is a website called Planning Schemes Online. And who's had a look at that one already? Okay, so let's call that 50% or so. And you will need to become really familiar with this. If you haven't started looking, start doing so now. But I also add to this that there will be changes at some point, which hasn't been told to us yet, at state government level, where this will be updated. In a good way, actually, like a better way of accessing that data and getting maps and things like that. So, so just for your information, and where are we? Oh, the website did something tricky to me. That's okay. And so that's the end of that lecture. So let's have a 5-minute break. I'll set up the next slideshow and then we'll go through the material of today, which is more contextual about metropolitan planning. But the key thing I'll show you is what is the connection between this metropolitan policy and these statutory processes. So let's try and come back, you know, in 5 minutes. Don't stay out too long, guys. Cheers. Okay, so we've just gone into some of the complexities of the scheme amendment process, as in how we make plans and how we change those plans in small and large ways. But I think it's useful now just to step back a little bit and think about the context for these VPP-based planning schemes. And one of the most challenging and powerful and problematic contexts is the metropolitan planning system around Melbourne, and I immediately acknowledge that I'm kind of privileging this over regional planning, which is outside of the environs of Melbourne, and I fully acknowledge that. I kind of deliberately do this because one of the problems in Australia is that we have very prime cities, as in much larger, much more influential, much more moneyed. Very much the base of power in each state is in the metropolitan area, and we have tended to ignore the regions except very occasionally. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through some of the things about metropolitan planning that we face here to give you a bit of an idea of why the planning scheme has certain things in it. So, and what are the connections? So you don't need to know all of this, but rather to get context. The other thing I wanted to point out, you can see this is from 2017, but it's the same thing. You can subscribe to this newsletter, which comes out every week, and they give you updates on what's happening in the statutory planning world. Sounds exciting, I know. You know, I'm there every Thursday waiting for more information to come through. But they also have events and other stuff on there. So you might want to subscribe to that to keep up to date. And sometimes they're kind of pretty interesting too. It's not all just, you know, amendments going on there. So you can subscribe to that. I guess if you just type in planning matters, you'll find it and find the links. So I'll go through this fairly quickly. So what's the context of settlement in Australia? The real thing I want to push here is that we really have a huge concentration in only a few tiny locations in the context of the overall country. Obviously climate and agricultural productivity and weather and those sorts of things are a key part of that. And indeed just where we started our settlements in Australia as European settlements with the context of Indigenous populations as a backdrop to that unfortunately was pretty much ignored at that time. So, you know, one of the things people often from overseas are very surprised about is just how we have pretty much always been a highly urban and suburban place in Australia. One of the longest histories of suburban growth in the world, perhaps the longest history in some ways. So what is this thing metropolitan? It has some theological overtones, but in this sense it's just simply the chief town, the chief settlement in a place. And when we stand here pretty close to the middle of a metropolitan area, I assume you're all highly aware that we're in a place of dynamic change. Melbourne in particular has a fair bit of change going on. I know there are some places that are even more rapid than us, but in a fairly short urban history, we've gone through many stages from natural bushland and forest to farms, to low density, to high density. And this dynamic change is part of what we deal directly with all the time in statutory planning. And of course, there have been some famous metropolitan areas over time. I go here to London because a lot of the planning for London has directly been taken on as lessons and part of our direct heritage here in Australian metropolitan areas. But, you know, where did planning start in Melbourne? It was the Hoddle Grid and a Building Act in 1850, which is another great example of how things don't work usually in urban planning. There was a quite well-drafted Building Act, and it required quite good quality structures in the central grid that Surveyor Hoddle had set out. 1852, bingo, gold is discovered, and a 12-fold population increase in one decade. Even the first couple of years were even like remarkable and surprising. And where did everyone build and where did everyone go? On the way to the goldfields, this huge, essentially a slum and shanty town built up outside of the area that was covered by the Building Act because they wanted to build ultra cheap. And while it feels pretty cold in winter and pretty hot in summer, it's actually a pretty moderate climate. You can survive in a tent. So generally speaking, and my ancestors were here as well, we lived in pretty rough conditions because people were just here to make money. But what happened, the context is, we all did make a fair bit of money and we became a very wealthy people, even the working classes, not universally, but very quickly we became relatively wealthy. And what happened? Suburbanisation. And as early, I've got it there, as 1883, it was very evident that people who had some money, maybe they made it through farming or industry or the goldfields, what did they do? They got a plot of land and they built a suburban house. And many, many examples of that around here. Footscray, one, but there are, you know, a lot of suburban growth. What drove that growth? It was the other thing, how we were quite wealthy and we could invest here very early, and it's generally understood as the most developed rail network in the world for that time period, rivaling the British and in some ways the German experience, where we punched out these railway lines from the centre, and all of a sudden suburban development and suburban living was possible. So a really rapid change occurred because of that, and relatively high wages by the working and middle classes so they could afford it, and the birth of the union movement, and we're not far from the 8 hours day, the 888 monument. I'm getting excited now. 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours sleep as the mantra, where people had time as well as money in relative terms. So this was quite remarkable for the time that all this occurred. And indeed, you can map the existing footprint of Melbourne in many ways onto this framework. So hugely influential. So let's think about metropolitan growth in that sort of backdrop, and think about how plan making can work in those terms. We didn't really have here any real metropolitan plan for many, many years. The only real basis of a metropolitan plan was the Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works. That began in 1899. Some people say 1898. Let's not quibble too much. And it was responsible for bridges, the larger roads and other important infrastructure, and sewerage. So Melbourne had a terrible reputation in a time of growth before the 1890s as being smelly and unhygienic, and with that wealth there was a huge building program, and some of the sewers and infrastructure around here are still there. They were built in that time period. So that agency, the Melbourne Metropolitan Works, existed up until 1988. It was wound down and arguably fully closed in 1988. And it was the de facto, the effective metropolitan planning agency for a very long time. But by the 80s, it was kind of over. So when we went to sort of try to think about metropolitan here in Melbourne after the Second World War, when this huge growth started, we looked to the Greater London Plan. Many of us had British heritage. In fact, much of our expertise came from the British Isles in some sense, from the UK, and we looked to the Greater London Plan for how we could do metropolitan planning in this huge time of growth. So I happen to have a copy of this on the shelf, and probably a lot of other planners do as well. And trying to use this idea of gathering data, analysing it, forecasting, trying to manage these wider trends to achieve societal outcomes. Very comprehensive approach, and the gentleman on the right there is Sir Patrick Abercrombie. And if you ever get a chance to look at this document, it's really pretty remarkable that they could do something so comprehensive. It was prepared during the Second World War with the assumption that if they won, as in the Allies, they needed to work out what they were going to do next in the reconstruction effort. Interestingly, Patrick Abercrombie, the planner of the chief planner of the time, had unprecedented powers in a Western democracy, in that he was almost like a military controller of a planning system. And in fact, as soon as the war finished, with much diminished powers and off the war footing, the Metropolitan Plan quickly lost its powers and didn't quite work how we'd hoped, in fact. So one of the big ideas, and the diagramming is not perfect here, and you'll see this is meant to be the green belt through here, and this was the big idea that actually drove many other big ideas around trying to control growth outwards. One of the first places where this was documented and set out as one of the key drivers for managing growth at a big scale like this. And you can also see some of the outer areas, as in Letchworth, etc., as these growth towns. The exact name's just escaping right now. So this was a big driver. it was also matched by attempts at master planning. This was also significant. They were trying to go the scope from the big picture trend-based planning right down to micro detail, particularly in the central city area. And we now have learnt huge amounts from this kind of planning because lots of problems occurred, for all its glory, it's still held up as a pretty amazing attempt. Master plans were hugely ineffective because they were inflexible. And the rate and the type of growth and all the competing local government politics and demands meant that, generally speaking, the master plans were never realised. They couldn't adapt to change. The private sector lobbied, broke the rules, didn't follow the plan. They went to all kinds of other places, particularly big industry. They just chose places where they could buy land cheap and they had good transport connections, not where the planners had intended them to go. Excuse me. And many of the social and economic impacts of designing the city of the future were kind of ignored, and the market and the plan didn't really match. But one of the big kickers was that traffic and private car ownership went absolutely through the roof in ways that were never anticipated, and competition between all the different agencies was not necessarily followed. So, I don't want to put the plan down, the Greater London Plan down, but it's one of those things we can look to for trying to start understanding why metropolitan planning is so difficult. So, pretty quickly off the back of that, Sydney had a go at its own metropolitan plan. The larger authority at that time was called the County of Cumberland, and they did something fairly similar, obviously in a different physical setting, with the mountains as a backdrop and the ocean over the side here. Green belts, which is that lighter green, sort of an attempt. So a lot of similarities, and in fact a lot of the same people worked on the plan as well. And trying to maintain these large swathes of rural land, the productive hinterland, in the background. Sydney, even more than London, had these incredible rates of growth after the Second World War. As many of you probably know, a great push for immigration after the Second World War, and local governments basically broke the rules and didn't go along with that County of Cumberland plan, and it was a huge failure. Jump forward to now, or just about now, back to 2009, 9 years ago. We are still facing these same problems. This kind of problem will not go away easily. Mr. Madden, former planning minister, made an incredible comment. I don't believe we will need to make an adjustment in the urban growth boundary beyond this one in my lifetime. You can almost hear people loading firearms in the background from the sort of the planning academy, because it was clearly never going to work. It was clearly a gross miscalculation for what was possible in the planning system. And indeed, since this time, there have been 7 or 8 adjustments to the urban growth boundary, because this country has a huge interest in ongoing immigration. It's directly linked to increases in our gross domestic product. It's very hard for national government to give that up. Whatever their political influences are, left or right, or whatever it is we have now that doesn't quite follow left or right rules. So that's probably not going to go away too soon. And what happens when national government sets immigration policy, the states, and particularly New South Wales and Victoria, get the growth. So we're here trying to play catch up with our state-based legislation. So that context has a lot to do with what's written in the planning scheme that you will be learning more about. Does that kind of make sense as a contextual position? It's quite an interesting one. And it's probably why, you will see that supporting development is written into the Act and indeed the planning scheme in many places. So we had a metropolitan planning scheme, so going back in time a little bit there, in 1954. And guess what we were trying to deal with in Melbourne at a metropolitan level in 1954? Sprawl. It was already emerging. Trying to zone things and retain land for community uses, and to separate incompatible uses, factories, from residential and so forth. Remembering that after the Second World War, we still had huge amounts of industry going on in the central city and the middle, you know, the Fitzroys, the Collingwoods, etc. So trying to separate those out, trying to get industry to go outwards to better locations, building a road system because it was quite chaotic at that time. It was a road system that had been designed before the motor car and before mass take-up of the motor car. Putting aside public lands for parks and gardens, etc., and putting aside land to allow us to build things like freeways and sewerage systems and stormwater drains and so forth. So these are all familiar themes. We're still challenged by these particular problems, even with all this experience. So the way the Metropolitan Plan worked in 1954 is that they just zoned everything. Everything was given a zone by the Metropolitan Board of Works, the MMBW. So we wouldn't try and do this today, but at that time, everything got a zone. And in fact, I chose this one because it's part of what we used to call the green wedge in that area. That's basically gone now. You can find a few little fragments of that green wedge. But you'll see here this huge growth down the train lines. You know, so those train lines that were largely set out in the 1880s and 1890s, the growth just followed those along and then just filled in around those. Then we get the birth of the motor car and we essentially start filling in all of the gaps. And an okay but not very good bus system as well. And that's been our story that was set out almost in the DNA of the city with that big push out with the train lines. So, you know, if we think about what a good metropolitan plan would have, and this is more of a provocation for you, you know, we'd have long-term vision, we'd have enough detail to make sure the lower governance tiers did things in coordination, we'd think about how the different sectors fit together, we'd think about the economy, social matters and the environment, we'd take people's views on, and we'd deal with changed circumstances. These are universal challenges for metropolitan planning, and we are still dealing with exactly those challenges right now. Every place with metropolitan planning has to deal with that. And you could probably say the same of regional planning as well. So if you want to think critically about metropolitan planning, you could probably use those principles as a starting point. So I'll just speak for a few minutes about a little bit of history before the plan we have today. We had a big vacuum through the 70s and 80s with essentially no metropolitan plan to speak of. Melbourne 2030, from 2002, this was brought in association with the urban growth boundary using the Minister's powers. So it came in overnight. It was the first real metropolitan plan we'd had for over 20 years. I think it had many, many problems, but at least it was a start at trying to manage the growth of the city at a metropolitan level that would match the local level that the planning schemes work on. And I'll tell you right now, one of the legacies that we are working through right at this moment is that we've had a fairly comprehensive, sophisticated, in its own way, statutory system, the one that you're learning in this lecture series, but it was never really matched with a comprehensive metropolitan or regional system. We're still fighting that war. In the late 60s, and it was repealed into the 80s, we did have the start of a regional planning system, but Australia experimented with quite a socialist approach to planning in the 70s, and if you know some of our history, wherever you're from, the Whitlam years and a relative progressive left planned approach was trialled. Unfortunately, that was associated with bad economic management. I say that, you know, in retrospect sort of viewpoint, and inflation and overspends. And what unfortunately happened, that tended to be bundled up as the failures of quasi-socialism or whatever, and basically planning bad, market good became a bit of a dichotomy. And we're still largely within that positioning now, where planning powers don't do much except mediate what happens on individual blocks of land, the statutory system. Dealing with the big issues now, like inequity and insufficient services, the planning system doesn't have huge amounts of power to redirect growth and to redress those matters. We're slowly getting back to it. So this was the first attempt in 2002, and it went through the classical things that a metropolitan or strategic plan would have, looked over the next 30 years, had key directions, breaking it down, compact. So I deliberately put this here because it actually maps on to many of the problems that were established as issues way back in 1954. Still remain because there's continuous growth pressure that we've had in Australian cities. And the beginning of this urban growth boundary, but the urban growth boundary matched directly with these growth corridors. So we've got a growth boundary, but we know more growth's coming, but it keep expanding outwards anyway. So here's the weird little irony that's built into our planning system. This difficulty of dealing with greater growth. Trying to maintain these green wedges so that there was some park system and some access to larger areas of green space, and starting to deal with activity centres. Where will we focus growth? So you'll find throughout the planning scheme that you're working on this attempt to try and focus growth around key nodes, typically of public transport and existing centres, or centres that could be built up more, that will be higher density with a greater greater mix, I should say, of services and things going on in those activity centres. And trying to deal with change. So what's the planning system in Victoria and indeed Melbourne really trying to do? It's managing transitions. All of these extra people coming, all of this extra growth, what's it going to look like? How's it going to work? So just one example, and the kind of vision that was around at that time. And we've largely gone towards that over time, trying to accommodate more growth around these centres with some sort of transport, trying to privilege good quality design, trying to provide people with the biggest range of services as possible. So we've gone through a lot of change because this assumption, really up until the 80s, that everyone can drive cars, they'll be able to park their cars, they'll all be able to own land, they'll have a large block with a detached house, kids will probably get driven to school. All of this stuff has now, we're confronted in these last 5 or so years with the fact that it just will not keep going that way. It cannot happen. We need to change this city where we've had a whole lot of advantages, the wealth, but also the huge tracts of land where we need to transform the city. So our metropolitan plans and our statutory plans need to be able to handle that, and it's an ongoing set of challenges. So you'll see here, direction number 9, this is a direction of the Minister, where the Minister started to take seriously the fact that we need a metropolitan strategy and that we need to link the metropolitan plan with what is in the local plans. So whenever you make an amendment, we just went through very quickly, a change to the local scheme, it has to have regard to the metropolitan strategy. So this is one of these key challenges and key functions of urban planning, and particularly statutory planning, is to try and join things up so we integrate what happens to get the best outcomes, to try and get all of the advantages and try and avoid the disadvantages. And as you go through, and we've started, when I first started using the planning scheme here in Victoria, it didn't really make any reference that I can remember. I don't think it made any reference to the metropolitan plan, which is locally based planning that we assumed it would sort of add up to a metropolitan outcome. Over time, we've seen increasing references throughout the planning scheme, but particularly the state section, to metropolitan strategy and having to integrate local decision making into the big picture of what we're trying to achieve at a metropolitan level. And how will we actually manage to deal with all this extra growth that we're having and maintain quality of life. And one of the challenges that has now emerged in Melbourne, and you see manifest in many of the debates and the issues that largely come out of statutory planning processes, is the two-stage city. And we have intensification and concentration in the inner city and the well-serviced, well-off areas, and we have low density and dispersal and low amounts of services in the outer reaches. And this is manifest in a range of ways. There's actually updates to this, but it's a really clear map, so I've kept this older one. People without qualifications, and qualifications is post-high school. And you can see these huge concentrations around the edge, and a few little exceptions in often their public housing estate areas. And these, generally speaking, well-off big swathes of area in the well-serviced areas, the places that were built first with, you know, many of the good qualities of metropolitan Melbourne. And then if you map, so that's without qualifications, where are the people with high income? It's almost an exact reversal. So what, you know, here we are in Australia, and we prided ourselves on this egalitarian society. It didn't matter where you grew up, you'd have a great life if you just worked hard. And I'm sure that's never been completely true, but it was true to some extent. But nowadays, where you grew up, where your parents are from, is having a huge impact on what happens through the rest of your life. And that's something that is deeply concerning to many of us. We got away with it. We had an easy time of making a really prosperous and relatively just society. But now, because we're getting to this big city status, and we're not making huge amounts of money out of natural resources, etc., you know, the challenges are now with us. And we've still got a lot in front of us here. And a lot of it is just this sales program of selling land on the outside and letting people live the dream. You know, you get married, you go out, but there's nothing around. There are very few services. You need to own 2 cars if you can afford it. We've developed the land so fast there's nowhere to take the kids to school or childcare nearby, so you're driving them, and we're signing people up to a very difficult lifestyle. And just this constant push and a huge drain on resources for infrastructure at low density, building all of the, you know, the sewage systems, the stormwater system, the schools at low density. Very inefficient way of doing it. And, you know, this story just tracks out. So without going through those and without getting too depressed, it's still a good place we're in, don't worry. But, you know, we definitely could do better. And it's this long-term vision that we need to work on. You know, are we really doing that? I'd say partly, but there's way more we could do. So let's come up to the present and think about how that integrates. What do we do now? So there was a process leading up to Plan Melbourne. A typical process, many of you will be familiar with these kinds of processes, or perhaps this one. We had the discussion papers, we had the harvesting of public opinion. We had a number of documents raising issues, getting people to talk, town hall meetings, discussion groups, etc. I went to many of them. You notice the completely non-committal blobs and squiggles that we use traditionally for these things. And setting out a process of going through this stuff. A number of things were mooted at that time. And one of them was this idea of a metropolitan agency. We don't have one that really is a metropolitan agency yet. And we had the possibility floated at this time we'd get a new act. Didn't happen again. They did a quasi one, excuse me, where, getting a bit inflexible, aren't I? I have to do some exercises. Where we would fundamentally change the system, and we might even have metropolitan planning and regional planning written into the Act. So at the moment we don't have it. Didn't happen. Too politically challenging, I would say. And then we're working up to Plan Melbourne, and look at these lists. Protecting the suburbs, That's an interesting twist, because remember in 1954 it was stopping sprawl. You know, so we're kind of accepting sprawl because we can't work out how to stop it. We protect the suburbs instead. But protecting the suburbs is in some ways about protecting the existing suburbs from new growth coming into them in ways that are not seen as attractive or politically palatable. So these challenges go on. And just thinking about how much growth we need to support this ongoing immigration program. So we had Plan Melbourne Refresh, and now we're on to Plan Melbourne, the one we have now. And how do we deal with it? And I don't intend in this lecture series to go through that in any great detail, but I would suggest you probably should read that, because the directions we're seeking to go to in the statutory system are meant, and I'd say we have made some steps, but it's a grossly incomplete project. But the statutory system, the planning schemes, are meant to sit under this overall guidance. And a really interesting question for you is, where does it knit together? Does it all fit together? And I think you'll find plenty of challenges to that project. But you know, they've got a number of processes there: principles, outcomes, directions, policies, and trying at this broader level to integrate and bring things together. I would always ask you to work out how that is meant to translate into action on the ground. It is sometimes difficult to see how the plan actually works. But something important you will see in the planning scheme, this is in the VPPs, any references, because we had a few versions, so different names of metropolitan plans. Where relevant, planning and responsible authorities must consider and apply the strategy, Metropolitan Planning Strategy or Plan Melbourne. And then you'll see subsidiary references throughout, in particular in the state planning section, where we're trying to bring that policy together. And then as you go through the planning scheme, you'll see how it's written into some of the decision making at that wider policy level. So you do need to have a look at these. This is the sort of stuff I'll be asking in the exam, not just the minutiae of the planning system, but some of the contextual commentary, because the exam, I'll be asking for you to show that you don't just see the statutory system as a bunch of rules to follow, but that you also see it as having values and outcomes, and are they practically being achieved in the context of this wider policy setting? A more sort of conceptual set of things I'll ask in part in the exam. But I'll explain all that as we get closer. Okay, so I've got one more section today, and worksheet 2 is now available, but please finish worksheet 1 and talk to your tutor about when to continue and go into the assignment. And I have one small exercise that is optional. So if you know how to read drawings, you know what sections and plans and cross sections and scales are and all that sort of stuff, and maybe you have a degree in architecture or whatever, you don't need to come to the next section, and it's just 5 or 10 minutes. But if you're a bit unsure what a plan really is, or a cross section really is, or a perspective, please stay. You don't have to do anything, but I'll just give you a really like a cheat sheet for reading drawings. Does that make sense? So I just don't want, because later you'll be reading planning applications which include drawings, and so I want the fundamentals to be with you before you go to that stage. So if you wish to leave and wander off slowly to have a coffee or a toilet break or whatever before the shoot, please go now, and I'll spend with whoever remains a brief 10 minutes or so to go through some basic stuff about reading drawings. Thanks, guys. Okay, guys, let's go through this. And as I say, nothing too onerous, but really I just wanted to make sure people didn't feel completely at sea with some of the things that others in the built environment professions might find completely obvious. And I tried to really keep all this super simple to make a point. So, drawings, and I've deliberately just set out these absolutely basic things here. Drawings are really important in the town planning game, not just the cadastre, which tells you what zone you're in or what overlay, but the drawings that are used to make decisions for permits. It's a really big driver. So I'm a developer, I get a permit to build a 10-storey tower block, and there's a set of drawings with it. And those drawings become, in effect, a legal document because it says, I can build this high, it has to look like this, it has to be in this location, on this address. If those drawings have problems, it could cost me a lot of money, or it might make council liable, my permit might not work, and so forth. So it's not the only time drawings are important in planning, but one very important component. And I was looking at my 12-year-old daughter's homework the other day, and I thought, oh wow, they're teaching them that in geography, cool. But I know not everyone does geography, but key information on every single drawing, and it doesn't have to look exactly like this. We have a scale, although there are some exceptions to that. There's a title, a date, a drawing number, who drew it, and what type of drawing it is, and of course, the north point. Here's a test. We normally have north going up the page, but what if you can't align it? What would be the next preference for which direction you put north? You're pointing that way. What's that? On the page though. I'm confused now what that means. So north would go to the left on the page. Would it? Started to be confused now. It doesn't matter too much these days, but when I was taught that, north to the left, but preference is up the page. The reality is it's not such a big deal these days, but the point here is when someone looks at the drawings, you want them to get it really fast. And particularly you're in the tribunal or in a council meeting and you've got them on the counter showing residents in the area. You want key stuff to be fairly consistent. Okay, so you know, why do you need the title? Well, you know, it could be the March Mansion, for example. You'd put that there. You know, you'd have the address, when it was drawn. So maybe there are lots of revisions in the project. You need to know what date things happened. Oh, these are the old drawings, they don't apply anymore. Or the permit says it's the permit given on a certain date for a certain drawing. So these things need to be really solid. So we'll get you some actual drawings to show you all this, but we've kept it simple here to keep it solid. Who drew it? Were they a registered architect or surveyor? Or was it just someone who drew it, you know, on the back of an envelope sort of stuff? Is it a plan? Is it an elevation? Is it a perspective? Is it a cross-section? So what sort of drawing are we looking at? So these things are really simple if you've done it before, but if you haven't, it can take a bit to get the hang of. So what is a plan view? Now, in normal English, we use plan to mean all kinds of things. But when we come to drawings, we mean something very specific. It's as if you're looking directly from above with no perspective effect. So this, oh, it's come out really weird on that. This kind of barn structure here, when you see it in plan view, you can't see any of those effects. All you see is the view as if from directly above with no perspective on it, and you'll see that the line type can sometimes have meanings as well. So this heavier line meaning the outside, and this light line meaning the ridge line. And it varies according to the drawing. I've just tried to keep it super simple there. But sometimes the line weighting and the type of line type might have meanings as well. So look for that stuff. And what is an elevation? Again, we're ignoring perspective effects. and we make it as if we're just viewing that from exactly from the side, that barn sort of structure there, just from the side. So why are these super important when we want to know how big or small or tall or wide are these particular ones, the plan and the elevation? Because you can measure from them, you can draw them to scale. Whereas perspectives, as if we're seeing it with our eyes, a perspective, you can't measure, without doing a bit of maths, the size, height, distance of things on a perspective. You can't draw them to scale. Whereas an elevation, you can have that as a scale, and often in town planning it happens to be 1:100, which is incredibly convenient because you can measure it with a standard metric ruler without even buying a fancy scale. Okay, so that's really useful, and so you will usually see in reality there will be a scale, 1:50, 1:200, 1:100. There will be dimensions on the drawing, and you could verify those things by measuring them off as well. So it's very common. It's kind of like a basic first day on the job skill in an urban planning office, being able to read the drawings and scale things off and check that they're accurate. It is surprisingly common that developers will make little mistakes on the drawing for their own advantage. I'm allowed to say that because I worked for 10 years with developers, and people might just sort of accidentally leave information off just to exaggerate the truth for their own advantage. So the plan is from above, the elevation is directly from the side with no perspective effect. The section is as if you've got a big blade and you've chopped into a structure. That can provide, and this is also drawn with no perspective effect and drawn to scale so you can measure off. And we have these sections so we can see what's inside. There might be different levels, or there might be ramps, or it might allow you to understand how the land slopes and the structure sits on it, for a range of purposes. So it allows us to see into the structure and it reveals more detail. So that's a section. When you draw a section, it always needs to have a plan view, typically, I haven't got it there, showing where the section has been drawn. Otherwise you don't know where you're looking. And of course the perspective, I just scratched this out in a basic program a few years ago, but the perspective allows us to see how something might look in real life. Now nowadays we have quite sophisticated programs that designers use to draw things, and they can look pretty impressive. But there's a number of things to look out for. Is that perspective actually accurate? Is it actually what it's going to look like when I live next door? Is that actually what I'm going to see? So some common tricks are to take the perspective as if you're flying in the air, which unless something happens radically to gravity, we're not going to do easily, or somehow the perspective is drawn as if I'm laying on the ground. Now often people will do that to make it look more spectacular, but also could be slightly misleading, because a lot of the matters that planning application can turn on are about aesthetics or overlooking, or whether it fits into the streetscape or matches heritage. So you've always got to be quite suspicious of perspectives. Okay, so let's just think how it apply. And I'm not asking you to actually draw this now, but this is a pub on Swanston Street further down. I thought this is an interesting one to just show some of these principles. So that's the photograph. It's built around now by RMIT University, which you might know the site. How will we draw it? Okay, well, typically we start off with a base plan or an understanding of the site. Here, I'm looking at the cadastral plan, so just to reinforce something from a couple of weeks ago. The basic legal drawing that shows the boundaries of properties, that's the cadaster. And we're looking at the particular site there on the cadaster, on that basic legal drawing. And now, just looking from a few different directions, Obviously, I'm up in the air from one of the windows from RMIT, looking down on it, just to give us another view. Here we're looking for what is now part of RMIT's, one of the big towers they've got, but that's from what was the car park at that time. Looking from the back, so what you see behind the structure is RMIT. And here is a plan view. So the plan view only gives you certain information, doesn't it? It's only as if you're looking directly from above. And one of the things about good town planning drawings is that they provide the right amount of detail. Town planning often doesn't want all the building particulars and all the, you know, how the joists work and how the fixings are. Generally speaking, we only think about town planning matters. So where things are, the building envelope, you know, maybe the colour and appearance, if say it's in a heritage area, how high it is, where the cars go in and out, is there parking? We don't need super amounts of detail. So normally good planning drawings don't have too much. So what's on here? So I've drawn the outer skin of the building, the bricks in a heavier line type. I've drawn a lighter line type here to show the ridge of the roof. So you can see there the ridge line of the roof there. The chimneys, but you can't tell if this is lower than that. We know it is because we saw the picture. But all that perspective stuff is not part of a plan view. And obviously it's not going to be to scale projected up there on the screen, but that might be at 1:100, for example, something of that type. And the street names surrounding it and so forth. Where the light poles are, etc. So the level of detail necessary to make a decision for whatever's proposed there. Okay, get this one right, first time. We use elevations to show the sides of the buildings. The north elevation is on the north side. The north elevation is on the north side. You'll be amazed how people get this wrong again and again. Just remember that. The north elevation is on the north side. I'm kind of exaggerating to make a point because it seems to be a great beginner's mistake. Okay, the north elevation is on the north side. Okay, so we've got the plan view. You can see where the different elevations are. Oh, wrong way. Okay, let's draw a north elevation. So we're drawing the north face, the one on the north side of the structure. Give or take, this is a north elevation. So again, we could draw this to scale and you could measure from it. And of course you can have more detail, but just to get the idea. And you can't actually see that that's behind that. You know, that part is further away than that because all of the perspective is ignored in an elevation. You can also see that the land slopes down. You can also see an outline of a tree, you know, whatever level of detail is necessary. Okay, so that's an elevation. And normally, when it's a fully complete planning drawing, you'd have dimensions and those sorts of details on it as well. So you'll see those soon. Now let's think about a section, as if we're cutting into the structure at the back. And you'll see here, there's a few different ways of showing this. I've done the absolute simplest way of showing the section is going to be as if we put a big cut through here at the back of that pub. So if we were to draw section AA, that part there, that's what it would look like. You can see inside that there's actually two levels. And you'll see I've drawn in a very faint line type the stuff that is behind. So don't get tricked by that. Often you'll see, just for detail to think about, that actually the building further back might also be shown as well. So don't get tricked by that. So you must always use the plan view that shows where the section is drawn in conjunction with the actual section AA in this case. Does that make sense? So now we might be able to see how people move through or how it interacts with buildings around. Sometimes you see pictures of people in there, so you get the idea of the space. You know, it could be about overlooking or movement or car parking, whatever it might be. Then of course perspectives, you know, that's me getting a bit sick of the project and doing a dodgy job. Okay, so that's the end of that. Any big questions about that before I let you run? You've got enough time to get over. So we'll do another version of that next week, and then you'll start using real drawings. Thanks, guys. See you next week.